Today on THF Digital, we have with us Dr. Barbara Kellerman, Professor of Public Leadership at John F. Kennedy School of Management, Harvard University. She is the founding member of International Leadership Association, one of the foremost member associations for individuals holding professional interest in leadership and leadership studies. A renowned author and editor with more than a dozen titles to her credit, Dr. Kellerman's work has been published in some of the topmost academic journals. She is on the advisory board of Leadership Research Network, on the advisory panel of the White House Leadership Research Report, on the editorial board of Leadership Quarterly, and on the Publications Committee of International Leadership Association. So let's talk to Professor Kellerman and try and learn some secrets of effective leadership. Welcome to THF Digital, Professor.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here and I appreciate your welcome.
Ma'am, to start with, tell us something about your academic inclinations. What made you opt for leadership as a subject of study?
Well, I actually feel that leadership found me as opposed to me finding leadership. My own degree is in political science. It's not in business. But even my doctoral dissertation had the word leader in it. It was about a German chancellor, and it was called Portrait of the Leader as a young politician. So I've actually always been interested in leadership. But interestingly, when I did my doctoral studies, there was no such thing yet as what I now call, I give it this name, as the leadership industry. That is, in the last 30 years or so, the interest in leadership has grown absolutely exponentially. That's not to say that there weren't always people interested in leadership. Obviously, Plato and Confucius, we can go back to the beginning of recorded history. But in the last 3 decades or so, the interest in this subject has grown hugely.
Ma'am, you are also one of the founding members of the International Leadership Association.
Yes.
So how did that happen? What was the objective behind the formation of ILA?
Right. I was working at the University of Maryland at the time, and that was, apropos of the leadership industry, that was around the time that this was in 1980, about 1980. It was around the time when it was beginning to become clear that there was an interest in leadership, not only, of course, among political scientists, but in the business schools, in professional schools, at the undergraduate level, in the professions, certainly in the world of business. So I realized that there was really no single professional organization intended to capture this interest that was becoming so widespread, and certainly not one with an international component. So that's when the idea of the International Leadership Association came to pass.
Ma'am, talking about leadership, who is that one person who has had tremendous impact on you as a leader?
Well, you asked me about which was the person who most interested me as a leader, who I emulated as a leader. I hate to tell you, but there was no single individual in my case. On a very personal level, I entered the field of political science and certainly also leadership studies when there were very few women role models. And among other things, I at the time was already married and had children, so it was almost completely unheard of for someone in my position to take up graduate studies. In fact, I think I was the first woman at Yale in the political science department to have children. So it was fairly new. There were no role models per se. There were no leaders that I emulated. I will say there was one man in particular, an eminent political scientist and historian, who was rather a mentor to me. And I think mentors then, as mentors now, perhaps particularly for women and maybe other minorities as well, they're helpful, of course, to anyone, but particularly people who do not traditionally have access to positions of power, authority, and influence. Mentors can, and in my case, did play something of a role.
Ma'am, you talked about the dearth of women leaders in your time. I think even today there are only a handful of women leaders we see on the political scene, in the corporate sector. So, there's always this kind of a skepticism involved as far as women leaders are concerned. So, do you agree with the belief that a woman has to be some kind of a superwoman, a woman leader has to be a superwoman as she juggles between her professional and domestic life?
Yes, the question comes up as to whether it's very different now from what it was when I was a graduate student with regard to women leaders in particular. I teach women in leadership at Harvard, and I regret to say, I wish I could say the differences were huge from between then and now, but I regret very much to say, and I write about this quite a bit, and I speak about it quite a bit, that for a constellation of reasons, the dearth of women leaders in the United States, around the world, in government, in business, in the military, is huge. It is notably not particularly better, that is the situation for women leaders in particular. I'm not talking about women having access to jobs. I'm not even talking about pay equity, although it's still not equal. It's a little bit better. I'm talking particularly about women having access to positions of leadership. That is miserable now as it was miserable then. The figures in every sector around the world are very poor. Now, the question comes up all the time, why in the year 2011 should this still be so? Why are we not noticing something of an improvement? The answers, I hesitate to say, are really complicated. It's not as if one can point to some dominant male hierarchy and say, oh, it's their fault. It's not as if we can point to women and say, well, they're just not trying hard enough, it's their fault. It is some combination of the circumstance, of perhaps even women themselves. I can only speak with authority about women in the United States, but as I experience when I have women in their late 20s and 30s in my classes, virtually all of them are daunted by the prospect of being a leader, a top leader or manager, and the demands that necessarily entails, and trying to combine that with the demands of having a family. And it's not uncommon, particularly since the workplace is not family friendly, or at least most workplaces are not family friendly, for women to opt out for at least part of their careers and say, I'd rather be home with my kids as opposed to being a top leader. This is not just a problem for women, it is a political leader. And finally, there is some impact of culture on the nature of the leadership. So what it takes to acquire loyal followers in a, let's say, in an educational institution in India might be quite different from what it takes to acquire loyalty among followers in a corporate institution in modern-day 21st century Brazil. So I think one has to be very, even those kinds of questions are frequently asked, I think what the student of leadership needs to avoid above all is a simplistic answer that makes it sound as if one answer fits all. It is so contextually determined. There are some universals, but the kinds of questions, particularly pertaining to follower loyalty, really are very contextually determined. So I would be leery of one answer fitting all situations.
Ma'am, just one last question. What is that one trait or behavior that has derailed the careers of most leaders?
What is the one trait that has derailed? Again, it's very difficult to answer across the board. I would say that having a reality check for leaders, somehow surrounding yourself with people who have, number one, an objective sense as opposed to totally a subjective sense because of their loyalty to you in particular, of what really is happening, and number two, to be bold enough and self-confident enough to be able to offer their own opinions. I call that good followership. That is surrounding yourself with people who are sturdy enough and objective enough to tell you what they think is going on, and if necessary, to ask you either to shift gears or to get out of the way. It's not uncommon for leaders, as they are deteriorating in their performance, to hold on even tighter to the levers of power. So a willingness to let go, and that enabled by followers who are, as I said, objective and courageous enough to speak truth to power, that is always a benefit and least likely to result over the long term in what I generically call bad leadership.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge with THF Digital, ma'am. It was wonderful talking to you.
Thank you so much for your wonderful questions. Thank you. It's good to be with you.
So that was Dr. Barbara Kellerman talking on leadership issues. This is Srishti Malasi reporting for thfdigital.com.